Alright guys, so Chapter 7. The 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, who is the Republican nominee for the 47th President, if you guys know, just survived an attack. He survived an attack, and an assassination attack. And dude, this chapter is very long. It's extremely long. It's damn near 50 pages, my guys. But we're gonna continue trudging forward. Anyway, he survived the assassination attack, which is there's a lot of questions about it. But so Chapter 7, Trump Tower, the Tiffany location. It was not an auspicious start, my meeting with Franklin Jarman. From the time I took an apartment in Manhattan in 1971 and began walking the streets, the sight that excited me the most was the 11-story building at 57th Street and 5th Avenue that housed Bonwit Teller. The main attraction was location, but in addition, it was on an unusually large piece of property. In my mind, that combination made it perhaps the greatest single piece of real estate in New York City. Location, large piece of property. Location and the largest piece of property. There was the potential to build a great building in a prime location. Bonwit was owned by Genesco, a company founded in the late 1950s by a gentleman named W. Maxey Jarman, who built it into a real high-flying conglomerate. Maxey started off with a shoe company, then he began buying other shoe companies, and eventually he moved into retail stores, purchasing Tiffany and Henry Bendel and Bonwit Teller. But then in the mid-1970s, a tremendous battle began to take shape between Maxey and his son Franklin. They were both strong guys with their own ideas, and they both wanted control. It became so bitter that they finally came to blows at a stockholder meeting. Since I am so close to my father, I found the whole thing hard to believe, but the bottom line was that Franklin finally managed to push his father out and take over. And so in 1975, it was Franklin I called to discuss my interest in Bonwit. At the time, I really had no track record. I was trying to get the Grand Hyatt off the ground, and I was still fighting for my convention center site. And nothing had yet gelled, but for whatever reason, Franklin Jarman was willing to see me. We met, and I told him straight out that I would love to buy the Bonwit Teller store and building. I knew this was a tough sell, so I tried to find ways to make the deal sound more attractive. I suggested, for example, that I would build above his store and that he could keep it open during construction. That's not really feasible, but the point was that I would have done almost anything to get that piece of property. Even before I'd finished my pitch, I could see from the look on Franklin's face that he thought this was perhaps the most preposterous thing he had ever heard. When I was done, he said to me very politely, but also very firmly, "You've got to be crazy if you think there's any way we'd ever sell this incredible site." We shook hands and I left, believing that under no circumstances would I or anybody else ever purchase his property. It was a dead issue. Even so, I didn't give up. I began writing letters to Franklin Jarman. First, I wrote to thank him for seeing me. A couple of months later, I wrote to ask if he might reconsider. When I got no answer and a few more months had gone by, I wrote again and said I'd love to drop by and see him again. More time passed and I wrote another letter suggesting a whole new way to make the deal. I was relentless, even in the face of the total lack of encouragement, because much more than often than you think, sheer persistence is the difference between success and failure. I was relentless. In this case, Franklin Jarman never budged from his original position, but as it happened, the letters I wrote eventually did have an impact. Almost 3 years passed after my first meeting with Franklin. During that time, Genesco began to experience very serious financial problems. I didn't give any of it a second thought until one evening in June 1978 when I picked up Business Week magazine and read an article about a management change at Genesco. The banks, trying to save the company from declaring bankruptcy, had insisted that a new chief executive be put in charge. The man's name was John Hannigan, and he was something of a turnaround artist. He just successfully saved AMF Brunswick, which had been ready to go down the drain. His specialty was something called pruning, which is just a nice way of saying that he took companies apart. In other words, he'd sell the assets, get rid of the debt, and pay off the banks. The key for a guy like Hannigan was that he became to companies or that he came to companies without any emotional attachment to its people or its products. As a result, he had no trouble being ruthless. He was a tough, smart, totally bottom-line oriented guy. At 9 sharp, the morning after I read the article, I called Janesco and I got Hannigan on the phone. He'd just begun his new job, but to my surprise, he said, "I'll bet I know what you're calling about." "You do?" I said. And he said, "Yeah, you're the guy who has been writing all those letters about wanting to buy Bonwit Teller. When would you like to meet?" "As soon as possible," I said. He said, "Can you be here in half an hour?" It just shows you that sometimes making a deal comes down to timing. Somebody else might have called him a few days or a few weeks before me, and the whole thing could have turned out differently. Instead, I went to see him and we had a very good meeting. It was clear that the company needed cash very badly and very quickly, and that he had no reluctance about selling Bonwit or any other asset for that matter. It was like a giant garage sale. By the time I left, I thought there was a good chance we'd make a deal very quickly. Then something funny happened. Jack Hannigan suddenly refused to take my phone calls. I must have called him 10 or 15 times over a period of the next several days, but I never got through. I figured that some other bidder had come along and that, in any case, I was in trouble. I asked Louise Sunshine to speak to her friend Marilyn Evans, whose husband David owned a shoe company that he'd sold to Janesco several years before. He'd become a fairly large stockholder in Janesco, and that gave them some clout. Marilyn said they'd speak to Hannigan on my behalf, and almost immediately he called me back. I never found out what the delay had been about, but Hannigan suggested we have another meeting. This time I brought my lawyer, Jerry Schrager, and we were able to make a deal. It was really quite simple. Janesco owned the Bonwit building, but not the underlying land. For the land, they had a lease with 29 years left to run. I agreed to buy the building and their land lease for the sum of $25 million. In my mind, that was just the first step. In order to put up the building I had in mind, I was going to have to assemble several other adjacent pieces and then seek numerous zoning variances. That's often the situation in New York real estate. In my mind, that was just the first step. In order to put up the building I had in mind, I was going to have to assemble several other adjacent pieces and then seek numerous zoning variances. That's often the situation in New York real estate, but in this case, I was dealing with an exceptionally prestigious, visible site, which meant every move I made was going to be unusually difficult and very carefully scrutinized. My most immediate problem was trying to keep the deal secret. I was convinced that if anyone got wind of the fact that the Bonwit site was up for sale before I signed a contract, I'd never make the deal. Once the Bonwit store went on the open market, everyone in the world was going to be after it, and the asking price would go right through the roof. That's why after I'd shaken hands with Jack, I said to him, "Listen, I'd like to draw up a quick, simple letter of intent that says that I have agreed to buy the property for $25 million, and you've agreed to sell it, subject only to the drawing of reasonable documents." I want to highlight this part. Keep the deal a secret, because the price will go through the roof. Quick letter of intent. Subject only to the drawing of reasonable documents. That way, neither of us can walk away from the deal. To my surprise, Jack said, "Well, that sounds reasonable." Now, Jack is a very smart man, but he wasn't a New York guy. He didn't realize how hot this property was. So valuable that even in the middle of a depression, there'd still be people lined up to buy it. Jerry and I drew up the letter of intent right then and there. Jack read it, and the only change he made was to stick in a clause making the sale subject to approval by his board of directors. When he handed it back to me, I said to him, "Listen, Jack, I can't live with that clause. In 3 or 4 weeks, you might tell your board of directors not to approve the deal, and that would defeat the whole idea of this letter of intent." Then I asked whether he needed approval from the board of directors to sell the store. He said he didn't, and I said, "Let's just take this one clause out." He gave it a little thought, and finally he agreed. I left the meeting with the deal and something on paper to confirm it. Once I had the letter of intent from Jack Hannigan, but before I had a contract, I went to see a man named Conrad Stevenson at the Chase Manhattan Bank. My father had always done his business with Chase, and so I figured that was the best place to go first for the $25 million I needed to make the Bonwit purchase. I explained the deal to Connie, that I was buying the Bonwit building and their land lease, which had 29 years left to run, and that I hoped to put up a great skyscraper on the site. So Chase, go to Chase. That was the best place to go for the first 25 million I needed to make the bond with. Immediately he said, unless you own the underlying land, that's not a long enough lease to justify financing. In other words, he was reluctant to put up the money for me to purchase a site that 29 years later, when my lease ran out, could be taken over by the owner of the underlying land. In other words, he was reluctant to put up money for me to purchase a site unless you own the underlying land. But I'd taken that into consideration. I said to Connie, look, I've got two alternatives and I think either one could work. The first one I told him was to do a very inexpensive conversion into an office building with the retail on the ground floor, because I'd be paying such a low rent through the remainder of the lease, $125,000 a year, which was peanuts. Even then, I was confident I'd be able to pay off my mortgage and still make a nice profit over the next 30 years. But Connie wasn't totally convinced, and even I considered the first option my worst case scenario. The first I told him was to do a very inexpensive conversion into an office building. What I really wanted to do, I explained, was to purchase not only the building and the lease, but also the underlying land. And I said I could build a big building without risk of losing it at lease expiration. When I told Connie that the owner of the underlying land was the Equitable Life Assurance Company, he got excited for the first time. That, we both agreed, gave me a leg up, since I already had a great relationship with Equitable. They'd put up a big percentage of the financing for the Hyatt, and by this time the hotel was under construction. Things were going very well, and everyone was feeling terrific about the deal. The next thing I did was to set up a date to see George Peacock, the head of Equitable Real Estate. It was September 1978, just a month since I first sat down with Jack Hannigan. Equitable Real Estate. What are these people? Equitable Life Assurance Society. Equitable Life Assurance. I'm sure they're still around now. Give them a holler. It was September 1978, just a month since I'd first sat down with Jack Hannigan. George and I met, and I told him I was in the process of purchasing the Bonwit lease for which Equitable owned the land, and that I saw a chance to forge a partnership that could be very good for both of us. I would contribute my lease, I said, if they would contribute their land. Together as 50-50 partners, we'd build a great new residential and office building on this incredible site. So I would contribute my lease, I said, if they would contribute their land. Together as 50-50 partners, we'd build a great new residential and office building on this incredible site. Equitable could have chosen simply to hold on to the site until the Bonwit lease ran out and then own it outright. But the downside, I pointed out to George, was that then they would have to settle for a meager annual rent from a lease negotiated long before the value. But the downside, I pointed out to George, was that then they would have to settle for a meager annual rent from a lease negotiated long before the value of the New York real estate had begun to escalate. I also told George that my other option was to renovate the existing building and earn a more modest but still decent profit over the next 30 years. In truth, I was no longer certain that I could get financing for such a deal, but I didn't want him to think that a partnership with Equitable was my only option. Then he'd just feel free to drive a much harder bargain with me. Fortunately, George took to the idea of a partnership almost immediately. He was skeptical that I'd get zoning necessary to build a huge building I had in mind, but he'd also seen what I had achieved with the Commodore. By the time I left his office, he'd given me a commitment subject to my delivering on my promises. Once again, I found myself juggling provisional commitments. I also enjoyed that my other option was renovate. Because I don't understand it too well. But the downside, I pointed out to George, was that then they would have to settle for a meager annual rent from a lease negotiated long before. Equitable could have chosen simply to hold on to the site until the Bonwit lease ran out and then own it outright. But instead of just getting the money when somebody wants to buy it, then they're gonna have to settle for just the 29 years of just collecting rent on a lease instead of getting paid out, or just selling the property, or wait 29 years and just keep collecting that rent. My next move was to use my first two commitments for the Bonwit lease and the Equitable land to try to get a third from Tiffany. My next move was to use my first two commitments for the Bonwit lease and the Equitable land to try to get a third from Tiffany. Specifically, I wanted to buy the air rights above Tiffany, which is directly adjacent to the Bonwit site at the corner of 57th and 5th. By purchasing those rights, I'd get something called a merged zoning lot, which would allow me to build a much larger building. Air rights? By purchasing those rights, I'd get something called a merged zoning lot, which would allow me to build a much larger building. Unfortunately, I didn't know anyone at Tiffany, and the owner, Walter Hoving, was known not only as a legendary retailer, but also a difficult, demanding, mercurial guy. Even so, I'd always admired Hoving because everything he'd ever touched had turned to gold. When he ran Lord and Taylor, it was the best, and when he ran Bonwit Teller, it was the best. And so long as he ran Tiffany, it was the best. I'd seen him at parties, and he was a man with impeccable manners, perfect white hair, beautifully tailored suits, and an imperial style. If you were casting a movie about the president of Tiffany, Walter Hoving would get the part. I decided to be very direct. I called Hoving on the phone and introduced myself. I was very polite and very respectful, and he agreed to see me. By this time, Der Scut had done a scale model of the building I hoped to build, as well as one for an alternative building in the event that I didn't get Tiffany's air rights. I brought both models to the meeting. I said to Hoving, look, I want to buy your air rights because that will allow me to build a much better building that you yourself will like much more. By selling me air rights, you will preserve Tiffany forever. No one will ever be able to build over it, and therefore no one will ever try to rip it down. Yep, so see, by selling me air rights, you will preserve Tiffany forever. No one will ever be able to build over it, and therefore no one will ever try to rip it down. The other reason to sell, I told Hoving, was that if I didn't have his air rights, for technical reasons, the city would require me to put in lot line windows, tiny little windows with wire mesh, which would look absolutely horrible rising up 50 stories directly over Tiffany. With his air rights, on the other hand, I'd be permitted to put in beautiful picture windows on the side of the building overlooking Tiffany. At that point, I showed Hoving the two models, one a magnificent building, which is essentially the design of Trump Tower today, the other my hideous alternative. I'm offering you $5 million, I said to Walter Hoving, to let me preserve Tiffany. In return, you're selling me something, air rights, that you never use anyway. Hoving had been at Tiffany almost 25 years. He built it into an incredible success, and naturally he took a great personal pride in his creation. I was playing to that, and it worked. He immediately liked my concept. Look, young man, he said, I am going to make a deal with you at the price you've suggested. I just hope that you do as nice a job as you say you will, because I want to be proud of it. In the meantime, I have one small problem. I'm going away with my wife for a month, and I won't have time to devote to this. Until I get back. Immediately, I started to get nervous. I said, gee, Mr. Hoving, that's a big problem, because if I have your air rights, I can build a totally different building, and that's the basis on which I'm going to seek my zoning variance. If for some reason you change your mind while you're away, I'll have done a great deal of architectural work and zoning work, which I'll just have to throw out. So what are you saying? Gee, Mr. Hoving, that's a big problem, because if I have your air rights, I can build a totally different building. And that's the basis on which I'm going to seek my zoning variance. If for some reason you change your mind while you're away, I'll have done a great deal of architectural work and zoning work, which I'll just have to throw out. Walter Hoving looked at me as if I insulted him. Young man, he said, perhaps you didn't understand. I shook your hand. I made a deal with you. That's that. I was speechless. You have to understand where I was coming from. While there are certainly honorable people in the real estate business, I was more accustomed to the sort of people with whom you don't want to waste the effort of a handshake because you know it's meaningless. I'm talking about the lowlifes, the horror shows with whom nothing counts but a signed contract. With Walter Hoving, I realized I was dealing with a totally different type, a gentleman who was genuinely shocked at any suggestion that he might renege on a deal. He also had a way, Walter Hoving, Tiffany. I just wanna, she sounds like a good guy. I also wanted to Google the Tiffany building. He also had a way of talking down so that he actually made me feel a little guilty for even suggesting that anything could possibly go wrong in our deal. As it happened, Walter Hoving went away. No sooner had he left than Philip Morris made a deal to buy the air rights over Grand Central at a price far in excess of what I agreed to pay for the Tiffany air rights, which were in a much better location. As it happened, Walter Hoving went away. No sooner had he left than Philip Morris made a deal to buy the air rights over Grand Central at a price far in excess of what I agreed to pay for the Tiffany air rights, which were in a much better location. Then during that same month, several more air rights deals were made, also for very big numbers. Quite simply, New York City was recovering and the real estate market was beginning to go through the roof. I knew Hoving was honorable, but I couldn't help worrying about how he was going to feel when he heard about those other deals. Several days after he returned, we met to talk over some points in our deal. Sure enough, even as we sat down, two of his executives began to try to talk him out of making the deal by pointing out what had happened in the market. I was upset, but I could see very quickly that Hoving was even more upset. "Gentlemen," he said, "I shook hands with this young man over a month ago. When I make a deal, that's the deal, whether it's a good one or a bad one. And I trust I won't have to explain myself again." Later, I heard that Hoving went even a step further. During the same period, he apparently decided to make another deal much bigger than the one with me to sell Tiffany to the Avon Corporation. I thought Avon was a rather second-rate buyer for a classy store like Tiffany. On the other hand, they'd offered to pay such an inflated price that I couldn't blame Hoving for agreeing to sell. However, as one of the conditions of its purchase, Avon wanted Hoving to agree not to go through with the air rights deal with me. Hoving, I heard, stood totally firm. If Avon had a problem with the air rights deal, he told their executives, then they didn't have to buy his store. They dropped the demand and bought the store, and my deal went through. So Avon... Walter Hoving was just a totally honorable, totally classy man. That's exactly what made him such a brilliant retailer, and it's why Tiffany has never been the same since he left. I'll give you a small example. Hoving had a policy at Tiffany that when his best customers came in, they could pick out what they wanted, sign for it, and be billed later. It was very simple and very elegant. No sooner did Avon take over than their team of accountants started instituting new policies, including the introduction of little blue plastic Tiffany credit cards. That was fine, except that all of a sudden Tiffany's best customers were told that they too had to use the little plastic cards. It was not only stupid, it was self-defeating. You want your best customers to feel special. Before very long, Hoving, who'd agreed at first to stay on as a consultant, got fed up and left. That just made things worse. As long as Hoving ran Tiffany, for example, you never see peddlers out front on the street selling fake watches and cheap jewelry, blocking pedestrians and degrading Fifth Avenue. Whenever Walter Hoving saw a peddler, he'd go to his people and he'd start screaming in his dignified manner, "How dare you let them do that?" And within minutes, the peddler would be gone. But as soon as Hoving left, a dozen street peddlers immediately set up shop in front of Tiffany. And they haven't moved since. However, I learned a lesson from Walter Hoving. I now employ some very large security people who make absolutely sure that the street in front of Trump Tower is kept clean, pristine, and free of peddlers. Once I got Tiffany's air rights, there was just one more parcel I needed. Adjacent to Tiffany's along 57th Street and leased by Bonwit was a tiny site, perhaps 4,000 square feet, that was critical if I was going to build the building I had in mind. Under the zoning regulations, you're required to have a minimum of 30 feet of open space. Under the zoning rights, you're required to have a minimum of 30 feet of open space, a rear yard behind any building. Without this last piece, I would have been forced to chop the rear yard out of the building we'd already designed, and that would have been a disaster. Without this last piece, I would have been forced to chop the rear yard out of the building we'd already designed. That would have been a disaster. The piece I wanted was owned by a man named Leonard Kendall. By buying the overall Bonwit lease, I effectively controlled the site, but once again, my problem was a short lease. It had less than 20 years to run and also included provisions that made any zoning charges. It had less than 20 years to run and also included provisions that made any zoning changes practically impossible. Fortunately, Leonard Kandel, like Hoving, is a totally honorable man. Leonard began in real estate by buying apartment buildings in the Bronx in the 30s and 40s, but unlike most small landlords, he decided to get out when he saw rent control coming. He sold all his buildings and came to Manhattan, where he began buying up leaseholds on prime property. Buying up leaseholds. He decided to get out while he saw rent control coming, meaning the land under buildings. He began buying up leaseholds on prime property, meaning land under buildings. As the market rose, Leonard became very rich and with none of the problems of having to run the buildings himself. Meanwhile, the landlords who stayed in the Bronx went down the tubes because sure enough, rent control proved to be a disaster for them. As the market rose, Leonard became very rich and with none of the problems of having to run the buildings himself. Meanwhile, the landlords who stayed in the Bronx went down the tubes. Sure enough, rent control proved to be a disaster. One reason I left Brooklyn and my father's business was to escape rent control, and so from the start, Leonard and I had an affinity. My problem was that Leonard wasn't a seller. It wasn't a matter of price or that he had any particular attachment to his 57th Street parcel. It was simply that Leonard didn't sell anything, on the theory that in the long run, land prices in Manhattan were headed in only one direction, and that was up. He was exactly right, of course. And though we got along fine, Leonard wouldn't budge. Then one day I discovered an unexpected bonus in my Tiffany deal. I was reviewing my air rights contract when I came across a clause that gave Tiffany an option to purchase the adjoining Kandel property within a certain time frame. I said to myself, holy Christmas, this could give me a lever to make a deal with Leonard. So I went back to Walter and I said, listen, you're never going to buy that Kandel site. So would you mind if I also bought your option as part of my deal? So I went back to Walter and I said, listen, you're never going to buy the Kandel, so would you mind if I bought your option as well? Part of my deal. Walter agreed. We put it into my deal and immediately I exercised the option. At first, Leonard took the position that I didn't have the right to exercise the option because it belonged to Tiffany and therefore was not transferable. Leonard may have been right, but it was also possible in a litigation that I would win the right to exercise the option. When I pointed this out to Leonard, we sat down together, and in no more than 20 minutes, we made a deal that was good for both of us. I agreed to withdraw my exercise of the option, and in return, Leonard agreed to extend my lease on the site from 20 years to 100 years, which was long enough to make it financeable. He also rewrote the lease to eliminate any prohibitions against rezoning. And while I agreed to pay a slightly higher rent, it was still very low for a long lease on such a prime site. Leonard and I shook hands and we've remained very good friends. It's funny how things turn around. Leonard is an older man, and in the past couple of years he's begun giving thought to his heirs and his estate. I didn't highlight, that's a good, I didn't highlight nothing, I got lost right there. Options. It's all good right here, it's all good. It's funny, okay, so it's funny how things turn around. Leonard is an older man, and so we extend my lease on the site 20 years to 100 years. Extend my lease. Made it financeable. He also rewrote the lease to eliminate any prohibitions. Well, because remember, Leonard owns the land. To eliminate any prohibitions against rezoning. Early in 1986, he called and said he'd like to make a gift of a 15% interest. Okay, it's funny how things turn around. Leonard is an older man, and in the past couple of years, he's begun giving thought to his heirs and his estate. Early in 1986, he called and said he'd like to make me a gift of a 15% interest in the land under the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Central Park South, which is one of his more valuable holdings. Early in 1986, what's this guy's name? This dude. Leonard Kandel and Hoving. Leonard Kandel and Hoving. Walter Hoving. Leonard Kandel and Walter Hoving. Early in 1986, he called and said he'd like to make me a gift of a 15% interest in the land under the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Central Park South, which is one of his more valuable holdings. In addition, he gave me control over the disposition of the land when the hotel's lease comes up in approximately 25 years. His purpose, Leonard told me, was to put the land in the hands of someone he thought would get the most value from it, which in turn would benefit his heirs, who retain a majority ownership. Leonard is a very generous man, and he's also very smart. I'll be fighting like hell for the Candell family. By the time I got the Candell site on 57th Street, it was December 1978, and I was in a delicate situation. I'd pieced together everything I needed. I'd managed to keep the deal completely secret, but I still had no contract with Genesco. As 1979 began, my lawyers were still discussing a few final points with the Genesco lawyers, and we expected to sign contracts no later than February. But in mid-January, word finally began to leak out to the real estate community that Genesco might be making a deal to sell the Bonwit site. Just as I predicted, Genesco was immediately besieged with interested buyers for the property, among them wealthy Arabs with oil boom money to burn. And sure enough, Genesco suddenly began trying to back out of the deal. Even as our contract was being prepared, it became clear that if Genesco could find a way to break the deal, it would. Remember, he signed kind of signed the little promise, the 25 million. And we'll stop right there, guys. It's a 30-minute video, so we're gonna it's probably be in 3 parts, pretty much, this whole chapter. So what are the guys' names? I'm gonna look that up. I'll show you guys. Let me look it up on my phone. What's the name? Walter Hoving. Walter Hoving. Tiffany. American writer? That's how he looks right here. Okay. What's this? It's right here. Let me see a Tiffany building. Tiffany building. New York, New York. Images. Come on, man. Now you kind of see it right here, right? Tiffany building. And Leonard Candell. Leonard Candell. All of a sudden I wanted to pop up from here, right? Tiffany building. Trump Tower is somewhere right there. Tiffany. Leonard Candell. Leonard Candell. The fuck? Anyway, peace.